42% of the current electorate, or registered voters, identify as independent, while only 31% identify as Democrat, and an even smaller 25% identify as Republican. Many people wouldn't be able to accurately guess these numbers even within 10%, as many people believe the country is closer to a 50-50 Democrat-Republican split, with only a small percentage being independent. This myth that we are constrained to a two-party system stems primarily from fear and the fact that 90% of our media is controlled by 6 companies, and therefore our perception is controlled by only 6 companies. These media giants are some of the most powerful companies in the entire world, with a total revenue of $301.73 billion in 2010, adjusted for inflation. The wealth and power of these big 6 have allowed them to dictate how Americans think, how they speak, and how they act, as us humans are social animals and tend to follow what other people do. The media helps to perpetuate the myth that your choices are limited to one of 2 candidates. People feel that if they don't vote for one of the 2 parties, they're throwing their vote away, as independents rarely win elections. However, they only lose these elections because people think they can't win, and they don't want to risk losing the election to someone they oppose too greatly. This circular reasoning is one of the greatest threats to our American democracy, as it instills the idea that voting for the lesser of 2 evils is the same as voting for the greater good. This reasoning serves only to prevent any real change and allow politicians who are not good people to be elected because at least they aren't a Democrat or at least they aren't a Republican. During an election cycle, there are 3 different kinds of nominating processes: caucuses, open primaries, and closed primaries. First, we will discuss the caucus. These are different from both kinds of primary, as it involves people physically standing and being counted, as opposed to logging votes on a machine or through paper ballots. While caucuses tend to require more time and limit the amount of people that can vote, as it is less conducive to the elderly, people with non-traditional schedules, as well as parents, they do have many benefits, such as making all forms of fraud extremely difficult, as well as increasing interaction between voters and the exchanging of their ideas. Alternatively, there are closed primaries, which require registered Democrats to vote Democrat and registered Republicans to vote Republican, and leaving independents out of the process entirely. While it may seem that independents shouldn't be allowed to vote in the Democrat and Republican primaries, that can easily be countered by what is currently happening in the Democratic primaries. Bernie Sanders is someone who has previously been independent, is now running as a Democrat, and is bringing forth many new voters, such as first-time voters, former Republicans, but primarily independent voters that will now want to register as Democrat. Additionally, most elections are publicly funded with no question of what type of voter each taxpayer is. Therefore, independents account for 42% of the campaign finances. And while this may seem like a non-issue, this is clearly something that is a problem, as many states have deadlines for registering as a different party, and these states have different registering days, sometimes months before voting actually occurs. Take, for example, New York. New York has over 3 million independent voters, all of which could not vote because of New York having a closed primary. And you might think, well, couldn't they have just switched parties? And they could have, if they had decided to switch parties 6 months prior. See, the New York deadline for switching parties was back in October, over 6 months before their primary. And having that kind of deadline it's just absurd, because most people didn't know which candidate they wanted to vote for 6 months ago. And additionally, closed primaries are host to many different types of fraud, such as in Massachusetts, where Bill Clinton was in front of one of the polling places, and therefore many people couldn't get into the place to vote due to his Secret Service. Similarly, in New York, 100,000 people in Brooklyn weren't allowed to vote because someone basically lost their voter registration. These types of fraud in American democracy cannot be tolerated, and we can't continue to let our mind be controlled by mass media. This can be seen and is reflected by many Americans as they shift from watching mainstream media such as Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, etc., to more to places such as YouTube through the Young Turks or Redacted Tonight, which expose these types of fraud because they're not controlled by larger companies.